Good evening, all. Thank you for joining us on what certainly is a better evening in terms of the weather than last week. And thank you for your patience with us. I think Dave's judgment was certainly correct, that it would have been far too hazardous and unnecessarily so for us to be out trekking then. This evening we wrap up our conversation about violence and the church's response to it. We're privileged to have with us this evening one of my longstanding friends and partners, Dr. Barry Hall. Barry and I were seminary students together at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis before the church split. Barry was fortunate enough to have graduated before the split. I didn't, so I went off to Seminex, but nevertheless, both of us have remained good friends, and in our time together at Washington University years ago, we're also research partners. We teamed up again several years ago on issues related to violence. Barry brings not only the perspective of a pastor, but also the perspective of the scientist to the table. He currently serves as the Vice Chairman of Psychiatry and Professor of Psychiatry at Washington University School of Medicine. He's the Psychologist in Chief at Barnes-Jewish Hospital and has a broad resume that includes research in the area of organ donation and transplantation, dialysis, as you'll hear tonight, responding to large-scale trauma, including 9/11, and all of which have led him to reflect a bit on what is the nature of evil, and how does our understanding of evil undergird the way in which we approach violence. We'll take a break in an hour after a time for some conversation, and conclude our discussion with the talk about what is and has been for the past several years the scourge of St. Louis, the nature of gun violence, and what we as people of faith and communities of faith might be able to do about that. In the meantime, we're happy to welcome Dr. Barry Hong to the Aquinas Institute this evening. Thank you. Barry?
Thank you. Mark has, over the years, got me in lots of different appearances, presentations, and grants. So today I'm going to talk about something that was an aside. We had conversations among ourselves, Dana Downs, one of our research people, about the nature of evil. We haven't really presented this to secular groups, but it's a thing we do with church groups. And I will probably raise more issues and questions than I have answers. Maybe all of you will have answers about it. And I also will give you somewhat of a scientific perspective woven in with some theological or biblical perspectives about the nature of evil. So how can we understand homicide and violence in St. Louis? And this is really what we have been talking about, even though we do other things. Am I not pushing this right? I'm not getting the red dot. Or
You're getting the laser.
No.
These are the two. This is the laser pointer. These are the slides.
Okay. Okay. So what are the causes of violence? Well, they're social, economic, they're cultural, they're loss of values, loss of humanity, family structure, failure in moral education, sin, disobedience to God. This is what people in the church might say. When you talk about violence, this is the first case in Genesis. This is the first recorded homicide. I won't read this to you, but this is the very famous Cain and Abel situation, where Cain goes out in the field, and kills his brother. And the Lord asked an interesting question: where is your brother Abel? I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Probably still the questions that we ask today. So what is the definition of evil? Well, one of the things, evil is not necessarily a religious concept. It is really just the opposite of what is good when you deal with a dualistic world. It's a way that we can talk about the devil, and in the Old English way of talking about evil, it really meant that something that was wrong and defective. An evil person is somebody who acts to cause pain and injury and harm. Before we leave this slide, one of my first psychiatry bosses was a very famous Jewish psychiatrist at Jewish Hospital here in St. Louis. And what he used to say to me, he always had these theological things to say to me because he knew I was a minister. And actually, funny thing is, his son, who was Jewish, went to Harvard Divinity School to study religious studies. And he said, why did he want to do that? He said, because it's God's retribution since you pulled me into medicine. So you did that to me, and so this is what happens. But he said something I think that was very important, and that he said, evil is banal. Evil is common. Evil is not seeing some guy in a red suit with a pitchfork, and like we could easily identify him. And what he said is, evil is out there so in such a common, acceptable way, we don't even hone into it. I mean, when you think about that, so there are lots of illustrations of this, but that's where evil is in 2019. It's not so easy just to say that person is evil through and through. St. Jerome had this to say about the human race, and he said that sin comes in three kinds when we sin. You either sin in thought, here's the thing, thought, word, or deed. Kind of, you hear that in most confessional formulations. But what's curious is that Jerome wasn't very far off from how present-day psychologists and psychiatrists talk about it. So we think about thinking, so Jerome had this, thoughts, words, and deeds, but what we talk about now in psychiatry and psychology is cognitive things. What are you thinking in your head? We're interested more in feelings. He instead had words, and this is the other one. We're interested in overt behavior, Jerome the deeds. So either we're parroting Jerome, or Jerome was a crude psychologist. This is the causes of behavior, either good or bad, tend to happen from this mixture. So situations can do it. I guess this laser pointer isn't like it.
It works when you blow up, and it won't work on the screen for some reason.
It doesn't work.
It came on the gray bar.
Yeah, it comes on there, but it doesn't work on the screen. Yeah, I don't. Okay, and so so behavior can evolve from a situation. You might act in a particular way and not in others. I give as a great example. So when you interact with your friends, you behave in one way. If you were with your mother, you'd probably behave in a different way. This is what's demand characteristics. Sometimes it's the individual's personality, their culture, religion, politics, and heredity. Now, in science these days, we talk about there are three things that really determine behavior, and I'm going to say something about it and then try to explain this. So we think that at the maximum, what you can attribute to your genes or DNA or genetics or to your uncle or aunts is about a third of explanation behavior. Your environment, all those other things we had, and then the interaction of the two, so the product of those two. Now, some people think this isn't like cutting a pie into three pieces. Sometimes some of these have more effect than others. And so you could have a gene that overwhelms these things because you have some terrible illness. You could come from poverty, or you can come from an enriched environment, but also produces behavior. But this is the mixture of how behavior comes forth. And it's not just one of these things. There are people who have the idea that there's a genetic determinism, but that doesn't play out. And I'm going to talk about some examples of that. Okay, this is a model from a German psychologist about behavior. And so if we're looking at behavior here, it's sometimes a result of some stimulus response. A great example of this is how we deal with traffic lights. So when it's green, we go, and if it's red, you stop. Hopefully, most of you stop. The other thing that happens is what's going on in your head influences behavior. And then the other thing is most people very often do things because they know the consequences of it. So all of you who are parents out there, you know, if you screw up, you're going to be grounded for these many days, you're going to lose your phone. And so behavior is influenced by all of these things. It could be a combination of these things. And we know from a scientific point of view, this is how behavior happens. So are good people capable of evil? And by the way, if you want to break in with a question, it's fine. I like that better because otherwise it feels like I'm talking to medical students who half of them are sleeping. Okay. So good people and evil behaviors. Are good people capable of evil acts? Are there truly evil people? This one is up for discussion, and well, I'll leave plenty of time to discuss things. This is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Does everybody know who he is? So Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran minister who fled Germany when Hitler was on the rise, and then taught at Union Seminary in New York. But as the Nazi regime went on, he came back to Germany to teach in an underground seminary. His most famous book was written in 1937, called The Cost of Discipleship. And I think it's a very interesting book. If you've never read that book, it is actually a very current sort of treatise about religion. He has a chapter where he talks about how we will eventually have to talk about religion without using religious languages, how we will have to talk about theology without using overtly religious and theological terms. Bonhoeffer was executed on April 1945 in Buchenwald. He was executed because he took part in an actual plot to kill Adolf Hitler. He was roundly criticized by many clergy and also defended by many clergy. And here are some quotes about Bonhoeffer to give him an idea about evil people and the nature of evil. Silence in the face of evil is in itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. And then this last quote, which really gives you an idea why he was active in the plot to kill Hitler. We are not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We're to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. This is how Bonhoeffer felt about evil. Another issue is, are you a silent witness or bystander to crimes and injustice and tyranny? Are you guilty of evil in action? You know from the catechism days, the sins of omission and commission. This is what we're talking about here. But this is a case from 1964. And this is the case of Kitty Genovese. Does anybody know this one? From maybe psychology classes, right? So Kitty Genovese, this is really what we call the bystander effect. It still is around, and this situation happened when Kitty Genovese was in a horrific attack on her, close to her home. Multiple people heard about it, but did nothing about it. Some people didn't even call the police. The technical term psychologists have used for this has been called the diffusion of responsibility. We like to have all these fancy sort of concepts. It just means somebody else is going to do it. Don't get involved. And so you stand by. Well, Kitty Genovese was on the way home at night. She was attacked. She was robbed. She was knifed many times. She cried out for help. And it happened that there were 37 people who heard her cries. I don't think anybody saw it, but they heard her cry out, and no one called the police. And the reason they didn't is they thought someone else will do it. It's sort of like when you lose power in your neighborhood, you don't reach for the phone, lady across the street will call. That's diffusion of responsibility. What happened is the person who molested her went away, and he went away for 10 minutes and was worried that she could identify her, went back, raped, and killed Kitty Genovese, and had, in this interim, any of these 37 people intervene, her life may have been saved. So doing nothing it's almost as bad as doing evil. This is a quote from the Lutheran minister Martin Niemöller, again during the time of the Nazi takeover of Germany. And he said, "First they came for the communists, but I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade union people. I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." Martin Niemöller's very, very classic quotations about being silent. This is another very famous experiment from psychology. This is the Stanley Milgram experiments, and explains how normal people can do evil things. So there are three situations here. There is somebody who's pretending to be a teacher, giving instruction. There is an experimental subject who is really an actor, and then there is this confederate. The teacher is really the person who is being exposed to this. And let me explain how this works. So the learner is strapped to a chair with all kinds of electrodes coming out of him. The person who's tasked to teach him things, and this is the person who doesn't know this is a hoax, is told that if the student gives the wrong answer, he gets an electric shock. If he keeps getting wrong answers, they'll increase the voltage by 15 volts. There's a audio tape that tells the person, keep shocking this person because it's okay, he'll learn better. And what happened was that subjects were reluctant, but some 65% of the subjects went on to shock this person at really very high levels of voltage, being reassured by the teacher it's for his own benefit and he will learn better because of this. This is a prime example that evil people, under the right circumstances, can be directed to do things that are really not, we would think, imaginable. So when you get in horror about, there's a fellow professor at WashU who's a pulmonary physician, and he always has told me year after year, because he's a Jew who honors the Holocaust, that Germany, being intellectual, being cultured, having universities, having the church, is no protection from evil. And you are fooled if you think your great learning, your intellect, and how sophisticated you are, that those populations and individuals are capable of great evil. This is The Banality of Evil. This is Hannah Arendt's 63 book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, but the quote is, "People carry out unspeakable crimes are not crazy fanatics, but ordinary individuals following the status quo or authority or normalization." And so even when you see in the news these records of either people doing horrendous things, unless we saw the case up close, we have no idea how that was actually motivated. But then, under the right circumstances, these things could happen. In 1973, Carl Menninger, who was the head of the Menninger Foundation in Topeka, Kansas, made this quote, "Mistakes, wrongdoings, bad behaviors, genetic determinism absolves us from ethics, morality, responsibility, and consequences." And again, I don't have to give you current examples of this, but this still goes on today. This is an interesting study. Back in the 1930s, there was a great interest looking for genes that would explain criminality. And one of the strange things in genetics is that you can have an extra Y chromosome and have what we call the XYY syndrome. In the 1930s, when they phenotyped, in those days that's a crude way of getting your chromosomes and then separating them, really painstaking thing, we don't do that anymore. But they found a high level of criminals in this prison in Carstairs, Scotland, who had the XYY syndrome. And so people thought that this XYY thing actually made people criminals. For years they tried looking for this. This is never replicated. But the idea is that sometimes people are criminals or terrible people because it's embedded in their DNA. Now, that's a hard thing to say, but I personally think that also may be the case with some individuals. Hopefully, it's not everybody. The reverse of this are males that are born with an extra X. So what makes men, we have an XY, and women have a double X. I always tell my wife that this was really a double X for us, but they broke off the small arm. That had to do with directions, listening, and things. So I always tell her it's because we're genetically impaired. But if you notice that XY is really, an XY is really two X's. Somebody just broke off the short arm. There was another, you had a question? Over there, yeah.
So you gave genetics, environment, and then a mixture
Right.
of both. Are they weighted evenly?
No, that's.
I think I just heard you say that if it's genetic, that's going to drive
Now,
this.
So basically how we look at human behavior on average, it's about a third, and a third that's the product between environment and, but you can have something in your environment or in the product that really drives that. So you could have, for instance, not all genes are the same. So you could have an overpowering gene that's responsible for behavior. So like if you had a gene for multiple sclerosis and you weren't walking right, it's genetically driven. But when we talk about it on average, it's a third. So people like to think in a very simplistic way. I'm not responsible, it's all my DNA. I have bad family, I love the lyrics from West Side Story, where the kid in the schoolyard says, "Off for Crumpy, what do you expect? My mother's a junkie," and then goes through the whole thing. So it excuses me because I have bad DNA. What I'm telling you is that in many instances, it's part of it. But you can have something in your environment that overwhelms it. You could have extreme poverty. You could have extreme wealth. It's going to drive your behavior in a different way. Is that?
Yes.
I don't want to be simplistic about it, but on average, you know, you want to say to people, it's not all pure genetics, it's not all purely environment, and it could be some combination how this joins together. Does that answer it without my sounding like I'm contradicting myself? Okay. So the other interest is maybe there are some hormones out there that are doing. So this is oxytocin, which is in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the part of the brain that has to do with feelings and things like that. So when people have low amounts of this, they're very distrustful, disconnected. They maybe have psychiatric problems. When they have normal levels, they're caring and nurturing and have maternal behaviors. This is very strongly supported from animal research, whether you're dealing with rodents or some more sophisticated creatures. But this hasn't really panned out that things are that clear as looking at a particular hormone like this. Yes?
Well, I was just going to ask then if it was over too much, then would it be a negative?
You know, I'm not so familiar with it. So if you had too much of it, it usually goes, some of the problems in biology, having too much and too little sometimes equals the same thing.
Okay.
And so normal behavior would be like this. It may be if you're deficient or have too much, you may not be acting the right way. A lot of times in biology, there's what we call like a window effect. You could be above the window or below it, and above and below almost have the same effects. Yeah.
Is this the hormone which, when humans have contact with their child, their infant?
This has to do with all of these kind of, and actually the hypothalamus is the seat where all of these hormones seem to have effect. And people, when they study it, they study a couple of things. Is your hypothalamus too small, like the volume is not good? The other thing is the brain normally has a certain symmetry. It tends to be even. So if you have a hypothalamus that's sort of distorted in one way, that also may be a problem. So I only have this as it's a popular example that people talk about. You could talk about others. I'm not, but that's but these kinds of things. So some people think the capacity to nurture or be sensitive, you may have a deficiency in your hypothalamus or the hormones that are in the hypothalamus. Here's another one I put up mostly for theological reasons for those of us who are Lutheran or Catholic or Episcopalian, is a Latin concept called ex opere operandi. And does anybody really know what this one is? Yeah, you know what it is?
Well, I mean, it's basically,
Yes, right.
It doesn't depend upon the person, whether they believe or not, it's within the sacrament itself.
Right. So lots of people get really upset when they find out their pastor or priest are capable of doing evil things. It's kind of a current thing. And what has to be emphasized is that the preaching of the gospel or administration of the sacraments is not dependent on the person. Martin Luther used to say, if the devil himself was to baptize you, you would have a valid baptism. And this is ex opere operandi, that the means of grace do not depend on the character of the priest or minister, whoever is delivering the means of grace. That's an interesting concept. I mean, Christians don't always understand that. And they, whether you're Protestant or you're in the Roman Catholic Church, it gets lost on people. All right. That may be something you can actually quote this, or you'll be. And who are examples of this? St. Paul, Martin Luther, John Kennedy, Martin Luther King. Sometimes I get a little teed off about Martin Luther King since he plagiarized his dissertation. He's called Dr. Martin Luther King. I always like to say it's Mr. Martin Luther King because he copied it, a good part of it. But doesn't mean that he didn't do great things. Okay, that's kind of where I am, maybe opening up for questions or comments. And
So let's pose maybe the first question that came up on the slides. Are there people who are fundamentally, at their core, irredeemably evil?
I guess when you ask that, the first thing that comes to my mind is psychopathy,
sociopaths.
sociopath, or
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are, and that's right. I have interviewed a number of people in my life who are sociopaths, and they are sometimes very entertaining people. They can be quite gracious to you at times, but they are people who have no concern about anyone else, and their only concern is about themselves and how people can be used for their benefit. There are people like that. There are some very evil people. I have unfortunately met a few of these, or tried to examine some of them, but for me, there haven't been a lot, but they've been there. Yeah.
I was thinking of the sociopaths too, especially since I watch Criminal Minds and all that. But I just heard on NPR last week that a psych hospital has been making progress with children who are really high on the sociopath scale by using a reward system instead of a punishment system.
Yeah. Now, and that hopefully that's fine. What I would say as a scientist, tell me their outcome in 25 or 30 years. So I have worked with a lot of sociopaths and helped them clean up their act. And sometimes I actually feel bad about it because I'm helping them to learn more pro-social behaviors. But in their core, this is just going to be more means for them to dupe people and use people. So I don't ever think they're really changed in any sizable way. But you can get people to change their overt behavior, to respond in a better way. And so these psychiatric hospitals that have high-risk children who are going to do these kinds of things, I don't know. You'd have to, if you could show me those children 25 or 30 years later. Now, what's interesting is there have been very recent research about children who were turned into the abuse lines in states. Now, what's interesting about it is that when you're turned into an abuse line, doesn't mean you did anything wrong. And so when that line is called about you, it doesn't mean you're guilty. But what they did in some long-term follow-up studies and data from the state of Missouri, if you had more than 2 of these calls, it's very predictive of criminality. It's very predictive of drug abuse and all the things we worry about. And that it wasn't even finding parents who abused and were put in jail or fined in some way. It was just getting a call. And there was what we call a dose-response curve. So the more calls that happened, the more strongly it was predictive of children who would engage in criminality. And that is having to do with not being parented well. It has to do with your issues with oxytocin, about being loved or things. One of the things that's really frightening is that most of the bad things that happen to children happen before they're a year old, happen before they're 2, and many of those instances will predict criminality and a really high level of high-risk behaviors later in life. That's environment, but it may be genetics, and it may be genetics and environment operating together. There was a hand waving somewhere. Okay.
Yeah, there was a book that we just read for a seminar, and it's called In the Realm of Ghosts. It's written by an MD,
I don't know it.
Gabor Mateo, I believe, and he brings up the theory. He works with addicts out in Portland, Oregon, and the idea is that because of all the deprivation at a very, very young age, that the addict is always distressful and has difficult behavior.
Yeah,
So,
right. I mean, one of the more frightening things about the business I'm in is the whole area of what we call developmental psychopathology. In English, it means all those bad things that happened to you before you went to school. And that those kinds of experiences, not having really loving parents, or even simply somebody who would hold you, makes a big difference on people's developments. And whether you end up becoming a sociopath or a killer because of the lack of those kinds of things. And there may be genes involved. We haven't really found those. There are lots of candidate genes for alcohol, drug abuse, even for church going. That's interesting. You know, so we need to evangelize the people who have the church genes. So, but those are issues, right? Other, yeah, lots of, yes.
I've been reading Screwtape Letters.
Okay. I read them a long time ago.
So I'm just starting World War II in this thing, and I'm just about ready to give up because I didn't understand what was going on. I mean, I understood, but I wasn't getting it. And I think you've refreshed me, and I'm ready to start reading Lewis a little bit more.
And how did I help you with that?
Well, I don't know. I get to see both sides of, you know, the whole thing is seeing both sides of good and evil. At least that's how my interpretation so far.
And you know, and I think some of the evil people in this world had their behavior seated in some evil things that happened to them. Now, you know, that may make us understanding about that. And then you're in a different quandary. How do you actually handle that? And and so, you know, are there people who do devastating things? Can they ever be rehabilitated and put back on the street? And I'm not sure personally.
However, that's a different question than the theological question, are they redeemable?
Yes. Yes, right. That's a different issue.
And, you know, what came to me when we're talking about the norms and the crowd and all that stuff, it was like the young man at Rutgers, South Carolina, that sat and prayed with those black folks for an hour,
Dylan
and then pulled
Ruth.
a gun out and shot them all. The people he hangs around with were probably very approving of that activity, and he was doing what the group wanted him to do, and was very acceptable to his people.
And so some people who are sociopaths or cold-blooded killers, ingratiating himself for a few moments just make his task easier. I mean, con men are terribly gracious people. When I interview sociopaths or these very evil people, they don't yell at me, spit at me when I come through the door. They're very engaging. In fact, to young doctors, they're the ones who really get hoodwinked. They'll tell them, it's wonderful. You talk to me like nobody else did. I never buy that stuff. I've met the guy for 15 minutes. What do they know? So I'm always very suspect about that. And so with sociopaths, the amount of positive reinforcement per minute is going to be very high. They're going to tell you all kinds of wonderful things about you. And that's so that it can work up to trying to sell you a bill of goods or rob you or do something like that. Yeah.
I guess I'm not really at a point of a question or even where I'm headed with all of this.
That's all right. I don't have answers.
But I'm thinking, last night, my husband and I watched the movie Black Klansman.
Okay.
And I'm thinking that maybe for, at least I would hope that maybe for most of us in this room, our exposure to sociopaths is going to be more limited. However, you know, the things you brought up about silence in the face of evil can be evil itself. The things about the modality of evil. I mean, it was just shocking to watch that movie and hear how they now, the racism, the anti-Semitism, even the way women were treated in that movie. I mean, so I don't really have a question, but
I think the thing about from my old psychiatry boss is that the banality of evil is so banal and common and usual, you don't even make comments about it.
Right.
You don't even say that's a bad thing to think about. And so unless it's sort of extreme, people just let it pass.
Because,
Oh.
because when does it become banal as opposed to just base behavior?
Well, you mean, and you know, I don't know what people's political persuasions are, but you know, we have a president who has made much of what he does is quite banal, quite common. And you know, then you have other politicians that are coming up to his low standards. And so that's what we have to really guard against, because it's that insidious.
But isn't that the way the devil has always operated? He's made something look
That's
so
what my
tragic.
psychiatry friend would say. He said, if the devil was out there doing something outrageous and in a red suit, said, you know, you don't need a brain to figure that one out, but it's much more insidious and much more common. And what he would say is that the evil lurks in all of us, and at the right occasion, under the right circumstances, we could be out there contributing.
Well, I think when you mention that, I go back to Carl Jung and the idea of the shadow side of the self and all the parts that we really are not aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I went, you know, so this good friend of mine who is a pulmonology professor, but a great scholar of the Holocaust, he knows that I'm Lutheran. He kind of likes to remind me that the church in Germany lined up with Nazism. The universities lined up with Nazism. The intellectuals in Germany lined up with Nazism. And they were refined intellectual people. That's how in the concentration camps they could play Bach, or they could play operas and then execute people. So you have a well-cultured country where people are educated. And one of the sort of myths that most of us walk around is that a well-educated country will prevent us from doing this stuff. It doesn't. A well-cultured country will prevent us from doing this. And so that's how banal evil is.
But isn't it our own fear that we don't want to, it's like the schoolyard bully, we don't want him picking on us, so we just kind of don't get engaged?
Right, or we do like the Kitty Genovese things, let somebody else step up and do it.
So how do we make our society brave?
One person at a time. One person at a time. Yes. These are great comments, better than what I get from medical students.
So I guess please help me define evil, because I'm hearing that evil, it maybe waxes and wanes, or is it within us
Evil,
at times
evil,
it erupts?
yeah.
And And then I guess I forgot where I was going with that, but.
So for most of us, evil is embodied in an act or behavior, what somebody says, what somebody does. And what are the motivations or the causes for it? What I'm saying, they're multiple. But, you know, you will know evil when you see it or feel it. So there isn't any question about that. It causes you pain, it causes you harm, it causes you discomfort. You know, and evil is pain inflicted on people for not your benefit.
I kind of thought of evil as a decision. I thought of evil as a decision to do something, regardless of the cost to other people.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting thing because it's sort of cognitive, you know, what you think in your mind. As a scientist, one of the Berrigan brothers, who was a civil rights person, sort of said it this way. It's interesting that on Sunday mornings we talk about changing our cognitions so you think better. But he said it took the Civil Rights Act to say, this is the way you act. I don't care what you're thinking in your head. So we controlled behavior. We didn't control what people thought. And what's interesting is that churches, year after year, Sunday after Sunday, 11 o'clock after another Sunday at 11 o'clock, trying to change our minds, and didn't say you needed to change your behaviors. It took the Supreme Court to say, you better change your behaviors. I don't know what you're thinking, but you're going to get in trouble if this is how you behave.
Yeah, and now all the racism is erupting again. It didn't take much.
Right, right.
The blessing of the president.
Right, but it's not, and the thing is, you know, our president, you can't rap what he thinks because I have no idea what he's thinking. And I don't even know if he has a functioning cortex. But, you know, and as far as I can tell, he can't read because he's brain damaged in some way. But it's what he says or what people say that's getting people into trouble. And I think we'll always be caught like that because, you know, when you try to know what somebody's thinking, that's tough. The only way we know that is if they tell us, and then you have to rely that they're telling you the truth.
Well, I was just going to make a comment on, what you were saying about the president, because as I was driving down here, I was listening to the news, and they were saying that one of his, when he meets with the leader of North Korea, one of his strategies was to try to flatter the leader in trying to get what he wants.
Yeah,
And so when you're saying that,
right, when you, I won't say this, but if you actually look at a checklist of a sociopath, you can do that on your own, and I won't comment about that. Okay. Maybe one more question, and then we'll break for a few minutes, and then.
Actually, yes.
Okay.
I'd like to make a comment if I could after the question.
No. All right, then you're on, Mark.
Thank you, Barry. I think you can tell from Barry's presentation and his sensitivity to the questions that you raised that he's an incredible gift not only to medicine and the people for whom he cares, but to the broader life of the community and the community of the faithful. One of the consequences of having the ice storm last week is that we're not going to be able to cover the topic that I enjoy the most on forgiveness and reconciliation. But it seems to me that we're at a point in this discussion where if you'll indulge 5 or 6 minutes, let me put out some thoughts that you might carry with you in the privacy of your own reflection and your own prayer closet. The argument that we make in that section of our discussion about violence is that evil is fundamentally, to the question of definition, not about behavior. That's a manifestation of evil. At the definitional level, it's the brokenness of God. It's the absence of God's presence in your life the absence of God's capacity to direct your thinking, the absence of God's presence to help you discern behavior that is appropriate. One of my best friends, a behavioralist, is down here smiling at me.
He's the one who keeps me straight in theology.
There we are. But, so the question then becomes, is that kind of brokenness, if you accept that the Dylan Root, who walked into Mother Emanuelani Church in Charleston, is first and foremost broken, separated, sociopathic, I'm sure, but also broken. Is there any redemptive hope for him? Not saying be released from prison, not being spared from execution if that's the state's desire, but is there redemptive hope? And toward that end, that led us on an exploration of two different kinds of brokenness and two different models each for addressing them. Kinds of brokenness, we have brokenness when groups of people respond to evil imposed by the state. Okay? Class, economic, social, racial strife against an unjust system is an example of that. Also, you have evil done on the part of individuals. Okay. So, against other individuals. Okay. So taken at that level, what are two examples of responding to the kind of evil that occurs when people rise up and take over the logical and sanctified activity of the state? The first example would be Nazi Germany. Here you have a group of people usurping the power of the state and turning it against all of the social norms and conventions. And how did we attempt to address that when the Allies won? We created the International Military Tribunal, the Nuremberg trials, tried most famous and prominent war criminals, subsequently doctors and lawyers and business people. But you'd be amazed to know that the Supreme Court, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time of the Nuremberg trials absolutely railed against them. Said, how dare you, in your desire to pursue a remedy against evil, the Nazis, that you create a sham court to address it. Okay. And in one sense, that was Harlan Fiske Stone, was absolutely correct. Because think about the consequences of treating it as a quasi-judicial process. Did it end ultra-right nationalism? Did it end anti-Semitism? No. We got our revenge. We got our pound of justice. The Wiesenthal Center has pursued Nazis since its founding. But did it fundamentally remedy the brokenness that created the system in the first place? The answer is obviously not. If it had, we wouldn't have Black Klansman movies. Okay. Second way of dealing with that might be seen in something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So here you have the instrument of popular governance being usurped by an apartheid government and repressing people and killing people. And the remedy for that was not judicial at all. In fact, that was very quickly rejected. Some raised the suspicion that perhaps blanket amnesty would ensue. And what, in fact, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission ultimately defined was a process of accountability and reintegration into society. And based on a long-established concept in African jurisprudence called Ubuntu. Ubuntu is intended to bring warring peoples together, to have them confront the evil that exists within them and the evil they perpetrate in their behavior. And once that's done, to draw a clear line and say, now let us walk together. No stress, no second guessing, you are now reintegrated to the community. So in fact, what happened in South Africa, for those crimes that were eligible, if you came forward voluntarily, fully confessed publicly to the acts for which you were responsible, you were forgiven as a function of the state and allowed to reintegrate into community. So two horrendous sets of crimes, but resolved in very different ways. And I might argue that the model of truth and reconciliation will over time serve the world far better than the International Military Tribunal. What about at the individual level? Remember when the woman was shot recently after being raped at Catholic Supply? Tim Fitch, former chief of police in St. Louis County, now city councilman, comes out and says, you know, in the good book it says, you know, there were lots of murders and we've got to go after the most evil among us, and this is an evil person and therefore needs to be subjected to the death penalty. So at an individual level, a sort of personal crime, we also have several ways of responding to justice, of remedying the evil that's among us. Think about this, for example. We mentioned Dylan Roof's killing of the 9 people at Mother Emanuel. Now, why is that so much a part of our consciousness? Is it because some crazy white guy killed 9 black people in the South? No. The reason all of us are familiar with that is because of the story that emerged subsequent to the murder. That at his arraignment, the families of those who had been killed forgave him. It's a great story. We all wanted to believe it, and it's not true. 9 families, only 3 families at that arraignment forgave Dylan Roof. The vast majority said, we're hurting, we're still working through it. And 2 families said, we will never get there. You have taken away our ability to be hurt. Okay? So this myth of sort of Christian forgiveness on steroids in the most egregious of all situations not only is not true, but I would argue is fundamentally flawed, because there is no accountability, there is no remorse from Dylan Roof, no empathy, no feeling, no emotion whatsoever. So I'd like to leave you with the thought, regardless of your religious tradition, if any, the model for reconciliation, both in state and political circumstances and in our individual communities, is modeled in the sacrament of confession. Whether it's the Roman Rite, the Eastern Rite, the Episcopal Rite, the Lutheran Rite, each of those rites has a number of basic and shared elements. First of all, it requires that the penitent, first of all, it requires that the person who presides, the priest, the rabbi, the imam, acknowledges that we live in a broken world, and the reason you are here and have wanted to see me is because you acknowledge you're broken. We've now established the ground rules. Second thing that happens is the penitent says, please, hear my confession. Thoughts, my words, my deeds, the things I know about and stuff I don't even remember, I am guilty of. Confessor will then say, indeed, and is there more specific that you want to confess? And it's at that point that you're invited into that conversation to rip your soul open and lay yourself bare. To be fully, totally, completely accountable, not to me, the priest, but to God. That moment, following that confession, so personal accountability, well, the recognition that we live in a broken space, the recognition that all of us come with some level of brokenness, the acceptance of responsibility for what we have done ourselves, and then the announcement of absolution. By God's grace, you are forgiven and welcome back into the family of God. But then, you don't get to just walk away. No. We're our fathers in the Hail Marys, right? Or the reading of this, or the reflection on that. or the need to talk with the people you've hurt so badly. Part of that absolution is not only taking accountability, but it is the amendment of life and the amendment of behavior. And while it's not an element of all rites, before the dismissal in Episcopal rite, after the confession has been heard, the instructions given, the Episcopal says to the priest says to the penitent, and you please pray for me, a sinner. Think about that model of sacramental confession, and how we might apply that not only in our daily lives, not only in our life of the church, but in our relationships with each other. Think about what would happen if we used that as a model for restructuring, if not jurisprudence, at least the way we administer the penalties that accrue, and how we understand those who have committed crimes. So in 10 minutes, that's a distillation of what we would have covered, but it seems from various conversation and your extraordinarily gifted questions that we might have a chance to fit in a few of those. So with that in mind, why don't we take 5 minutes and take a break and then reconvene here at 20 till, and we'll talk about gun violence, and then wrap it up for the evening. As always.
I'm gonna get some myself. Thank you.
How do you want your water?
I need to get up.
I could bring you all back together again. As has been our custom over the course of the past several weeks together, I'd like to begin this part of our conversation in prayer that focuses us on the nature of the violence we're going to encounter. O Lord, on whose protection our health, safety, and security depend, we implore your healing of a nation divided and unable to find common purpose in resolving the scourge of gun violence. Lift souls and offer hope to all whose desperation would end in self-inflicted death. Bring forbearance and love to our homes so that frustration and anger may be diffused through conversation, not violence. Oversee those places where we gather to learn and worship, that they may be safe sanctuaries for all who enter them. Be present where we work, that mutual respect and just relationships might govern our economic lives and disagreements be resolved through engagement, not revenge. Join us where we walk and play, that our streets and turf might cradle dreams, not bodies. And strengthen, encourage, and support all who strive to find shared cause in preventing gun violence, all for your love's sake. Amen. In the course of the next several minutes, I'd like us to be able to focus on the nature and scope of gun violence in the United States. How broad of a problem is it? Or is it just isolated to communities like Chicago, St. Louis, and Baltimore? Secondly, to examine the causes of gun-related homicides, suicides, and unintended deaths. Also to explore the evidence-based benefits and limitations of strategies to reduce gun violence. So what do the data tell us? What do we know, not just what we think or what we observe, but what does science tell us about the nature of this kind of violence? And finally, to discuss potential opportunities for faith communities to intervene in the cycle of gun violence. Let me be very clear to begin this discussion. This is not a ban the gun conversation. Okay? This is a conversation about the violence created through the use of guns. Okay? Those are two very different discussions. Scripture, while certainly not providing any evidence of gun violence, does provide us with more than abundant information about instruments of various kinds being used in perpetrating murder. Barry earlier mentioned Cain's murder of Abel. The Exodus version of 10 Commandments reminding us that we should not murder. Psalm 69, where we acknowledge a God and a faithful people who call to that God, asking God to blot out the enemies of Israel. And finally, Matthew 5, talking about an eye for an eye. Okay. Something from the very early days of my ministry in Ascension Episcopal Church in Northwoods, in a near community, the Upper North Side adjacent to Ferguson. Barry Jr. had been murdered in a drive-by shooting on St. Louis's North Side, right next to his house, several days earlier. His father was certain he knew who did it, but the police couldn't connect the dots. Barry's family was the bedrock of the small Episcopal church where I served as vicar. They were a large, extended family. They were involved in everything we did, and they were deeply loved. Planning Junior's funeral was complicated, honoring the wishes of his family, the traditions of the black community, and the Anglican liturgy all of us treasured. Everything was set for Thursday morning. I called Barry Sr. to confirm the details. However, he lamented that we would need to delay the service. What was the problem, I wondered? Family travel plans? Money? A police investigation? No. The funeral had to be postponed because it would take another week for the morticians to restore Junior's face to a point where it could be viewed.
That scenario plays out multiple times every day throughout our country. 2 weeks, damage so horrendous that the skilled morticians in one of the best funeral homes in St. Louis would need 2 full weeks to restore enough of Junior's face that his family and friends could view him one final time. And I include this not just to punctuate the nature of violence, but to remind each of us that in the final analysis, it's not about statistics. It's about people both living and dead. And it's about the consequences for our sense of community, our sense of tribe, our sense of faith. Our understanding of gun violence, I would argue, is in no small measure stoked by the media. For any of us who've been around journalism majors, you know the famous quote, "If it bleeds, it leads." Look at the front page of the Post-Dispatch. Certainly look at the lead story on KMOX or KSDK. More often than not, it's a crime somewhere. And the more violent, the better. The more bullets on the ground, the better. The more opportunities to show those little yellow bullet marks, the better. Because of the media coverage, I would argue that we perceive a frequency of gun violence that's actually much higher than it is. We'll talk about that in a few moments. We also get a sense of personal vulnerability. You know, it's one thing when we think about gun violence taking place in what's known as the Hayden Rectangle, that area in North St. Louis City and County where the vast majority of gun-related homicides take place. It's another thing when you hear the story about an Army veteran and his girlfriend who were attacked as they leave a Cardinals baseball game. He's shot and paralyzed for the rest of his life. My God. We may not go up to Code Brilliant, but we sure like to go to Cardinal baseball games. We perceive ourselves, because of that coverage, to be susceptible. And we increasingly sense that there is no safe haven. It can happen anywhere in our community. What's the reality? 2014 was statistically the safest year in our nation's history. Okay?
What, in terms of guns?
In terms of guns. And in terms of other forms of violence. Okay? Gun deaths per 100,000 population. Standard measure. So, calibrating for the size of the population. Gun deaths per 100,000 were reduced by half in the past 60 years. Translated, you were more likely to be shot and killed in 1965 in St. Louis than you are today, especially if you are white. We are, and that is true across the United States. Whether we agree with the strategies or not, policing has had some significant effect. Social interventions, the war on poverty, our attempts at racial integration and racial justice, our attempts to elevate the economic status of people, increased education, although not uniform across our communities, have apparently had some effect. Recently, however, we've seen an uptick. We're now at about 5 deaths per 100,000 population the past 2 years, but that's still a 50% reduction. Nevertheless, the rate of gun-induced homicide is 25% higher in the United States than any other developed country, period. That's not an NRA negotiable fact. That's not an alternate fact. It's a fact. So the question we have to ask is, why is it? You're 25 times more likely to be killed by a gun in the United States than in England, or Japan, or China, or Russia, or Germany. would that be? What's the nature of gun violence? Let's make sure we know what we're talking about here first. Homicides certainly garner the news. It's what claims the coverage, especially drive-by shootings and mass public shootings. But the reality is 62% of all deaths by guns in the United States are self-inflicted suicides. So when I'm out and about, especially in suburban St. Louis, talking to parishes and community groups about gun violence, and I begin to see a number of people starting to roll their eyes and saying, okay, that's a problem down in the city. It's not our problem here in Frontenac. Oh, yes, it is. Because somebody in your church, your family, your community group has committed suicide. And they will continue to do that. Another 2% are unintended. And notice the word that's being used. I didn't say accidental. When a child picks up a gun in his parents' home that was unsecured, that's not an accident, dear friends. That's unintended, but it's not an accident. It was totally preventable. Public policy is driven by an understanding, or in this case, a lack of understanding of the different kinds of gun violence. What do I mean by that? Start out with our sense of mass shootings. Mass shootings, defined as the murder by gun of 4 or more unrelated people in a single incident. So this is not, Junior getting angry at his parents and his brothers and sisters and blowing them away. This is somebody going postal at work, okay? That's what we mean by mass public shooting. Our sense and our perspective on gun violence and its remediation is largely driven by those large, well-covered events. Sandy Hook, the Pulse nightclub, the Las Vegas outdoor concert, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Immediately in the aftermath, there are calls for legislative action, judicial action, and therapeutic intervention. Friends, less than 2% of the deaths by guns in the United States are a result of mass public shootings. The frequency of private mass shootings is much higher in the domestic environment. So while we have the debate in Congress about what should we do in the aftermath of Sandy Hook, we don't seem to be having the debate week in and week out about Joe who shoots Janie because he's mad. Okay. We often see a call for increased mental health services. And I'll be the first to acknowledge, and if I didn't, Barry would remind me of that important variable, that mental health care, especially for people who are despondent, desolate, alienated, and at risk for suicide, is critically important, and we can and should do much better. But what do we know about mental health issues? First of all, mental illness contributes relatively little to the level of violence in this country or anywhere else. People who are mentally ill generally regarded not to be significantly more violent than the rest of the population at large. Now, psychopathology may be a subtext, especially among mass shooters. Great. So when we hear calls from Congress, we need more mental health services. Yeah, that would be great if people who are going to go out and commit mass shootings decided to register on I'm the crazy list and go in and see a therapist so they could be entered into the international database and no one would sell them a gun. But that doesn't happen, folks. They either don't go or they do go and they're dismissed, like the young man who killed 32 people at Virginia Tech. Went once, they knew he was crazy, but he didn't come back, and there was no mechanism to bring him back. So the suggestion that we can solve our problems with better mental health services is ludicrous. It's the right solution to the wrong array of problems. More mental health care for those at risk for suicide? Absolutely. Is it going to do anything about gangbangers on the streets and crazy people in Las Vegas? Not a thing. Okay.
it is not the universal solution proffered by our friends on the gun violence spectrum. What else do we know before we leave this topic of different kinds of violence? What else happens in the aftermath of mass shootings, which I've argued drive much of the conversation? Well, after Las Vegas, what was the call? We need to eliminate, to ban bump stocks, right? Probably would have helped and saved lives in Las Vegas and other public mass shootings. So that less than 2%, bump stock's going to do anything for the 62% of people who kill themselves? Bump stock's going to do anything for people who are doing drive-by shootings on the street? How about high-capacity magazines? If you're committing suicide, you have a chance to fire one shot. Whether you're chambering 6 or 10 or 30 makes no difference at all. The point that I'm trying to sensitize all of you to is if we're going to have intelligent conversation about gun policy in this country, if we're going to look at potential remedies, we need to have the right diagnosis and the right prescription. In Barry's term, not every antibiotic works for every infection. Okay? What about our sense of risk and perception of that? As I've already mentioned, it's defined by the actual frequency and our perception of it and the sensationalism, the hype that surrounds it. It's also, I would argue, enhanced, ratcheted up by racial stereotyping and preconceptions. Okay? Why are people afraid to go into the city? They aren't afraid that people like Dave, who look like Dave and who look like me and who look like Barry are going to shoot him. Okay? They're not. When I talk to my friends, some of whom are very well educated, run hospitals in rural Missouri, and I ask them, why do you carry a 9mm Glock in your car? You intend to shoot the deer before you run them over? No, you know. Do you have a lot of crime out there in, Cape Girardeau? No, but I come into the city once in a while. Okay. Seriously. We do need to, however, recognize that there are data that make it very clear that there are parts of our community that are far more at risk for being the victims of violence, including gun violence. The highest percentage are among black males aged 15 to 24, 19 times the rate for whites. And why might that be? There's no violence gene that pertains to being black. Nothing going on in the hypothalamus of black folk, okay, that makes them violent. I think I mentioned to you previously that I served at Ascension when Michael Brown was shot. A significant number of the youth in our parish were classmates of Michael Brown. And I took the opportunity in the weeks and months that followed, not only to talk with them, but to talk to some of their friends at Normandy High School. And I asked them about sort of what's going on among young people, especially young black men, and learned several things. They're hopeless. Why are they hopeless? Well, their schools aren't educating them. Hospitals don't take care of them. The state doesn't fund their food or their health care. There are no jobs for them. Their families are often lacking in structure, some as a consequence of the foolish policies that we enact, and others for sociological reasons. But they don't see a future for themselves. There's a sense of resignation. Phrase was often used, Father Mark, I'm going to die by the time I'm 23. What difference does it make if I die when I'm 22? I'm going to do everything I can to be safe, to protect my sense of personal integrity, to make certain that I claim the respect that I need, and to defend myself as best I can. But I'm not going to be around to collect Social Security.
So if we're going to talk and lead a conversation as people of faith about public policy around guns, what are sort of the things we need to consider? First of all, we need to start by challenging people that we live in a fundamentally safe nation. Okay? Far more likely to be killed in an automobile accident than you are to be a victim of gun-related violence. Second, we need to literally force the conversation to be segmented. That there are 3 specific categories of gun violence: homicide, suicide, and unintentional. Here's the reality. The Episcopal Diocese of Missouri, of which I'm a part, has a partnership with Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice. Part of that partnership allows us to raise funds for purchasing state-of-the-art gun locks and distributing free of charge, no questions asked, across the St. Louis community. Done more than 3,000 of them in just the last 18 months. Okay? Why is that critically important? Because if we're looking at unintentional shootings, if a gun is locked, kids are not going to be able to kill themselves, right? Now, here's a hidden fact. Oftentimes when we're in public settings, the police will be near at hand and say, you know, guys, why don't you spend your money elsewhere? We're getting free gun locks all the time. They come to us from Washington. They just sit in our offices, and we kind of laugh at them. They're true. They're being honest. They do come from Washington. They're paid for by the political arm of the NRA, and they're the cheapest, least effective gun locks available on the market, and the police know it. Now, why would the NRA do that? Well, gosh, if gun locks fail, and they don't keep Junior from shooting his brother, gosh, maybe having gun lock legislation isn't really very effective, you know? Or maybe you need some other way. Maybe Junior needs to be carrying heat to protect himself from his older brother, okay? Third, we need to acknowledge the limited impact of public mass shootings. Tragic though they are, tearing at your heart though they are an infinitesimally small part of the nature of violence, and specifically gun violence, in this country. We're fortunate in St. Louis, the dean of Christ Church Cathedral, the Episcopal Cathedral in St. Louis, was the Episcopal rector in Newtown, Connecticut at the time of the shootings, and was the first clergy person on scene, and can tell us about the power of that kind of shooting. But she'll also be the first person to say that cannot be allowed to drive public policy, because we'll make decisions that don't work. And when they don't work, the opponents of sane gun policy simply say, see, told you, doesn't work. Okay? The necessity for evidence-based solutions. Late Senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, made the observation, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. Okay? The conversation that we're having here tonight, whether you like the data or not, are factual. Much of the debate that occurs in Congress and state houses among people gathered together is based on perception, anecdote, fear, and bad information. And part of our challenge as people of faith is to correct that, to clear the table. Key facts about the public policy debate. Wonder why we have 25 times more gun deaths in the United States than any other place? Because we have one gun for every person who lives in this country. There are currently 300 million functional firearms in the United States. However, household ownership of guns has declined markedly from 50% to only about a third since 2000. What that means, if you put and sort of massage all the data together, we have fewer families owning guns, but the families who do own more of them. So for example, as a kid growing up in Alton, Illinois, right across the river, virtually every family I knew would hunt ducks and hunt deer. And in their households was probably a shotgun and 30-06 for hunting deer. Two guns, maybe 3. Okay? Those same households today have 9, 10, 12 guns, both long rifles and pistols. Okay? So it's more concentrated. Why is that a problem? Because gun deaths are 7 times higher in states with high ownership. Now, you may have a different explanation. Why would states that have high gun ownership, like Missouri, consistently have the highest rates of homicide from guns? What are the variables? Well, do we have more crazy people? No. More poor people? No. More young black males? No. What we have are more guns. In households with guns, homicides are 3 times more likely, suicides 17 times more likely, and unintentional shootings 4 times more likely. The point being the presence of a gun. Regardless of what you think about them, what you want to do with them, what you plan to do with, the mere fact that they exist under your roof makes you and your family substantially more likely to be victimized by those guns. Our friends at the NRA are fond of using the phrase, guns don't kill people, people kill people. The response to that is no, people with guns kill people. Okay? People with knives don't kill people. People with brass knuckles don't kill people. Okay? Some more key facts. How about this? The exaggerated value of guns for self-defense or property protection. So I buy a gun because I live in Tower Grove South, and there have been a number of carjackings there, and I really want to protect myself. Okay? Good motivation. What's likely to happen? You're 11 times more likely to have that gun used by someone in your house to commit suicide. You're 7 times more likely to have your own gun used on you to kill you. And you're 4 times more likely to have your child be shot and killed by that gun in an unintentional shooting. What drives this message home? Probably the best study controlled shooting is done with the New York City Police Department, where officers are required monthly to qualify on a firing range under supervision with their service revolver. Okay? The most highly trained peace officers in the United States. And when you take a look at how successful they are when they're in a criminal encounter that involves a shooting, they hit their target somewhere between 18 and 30% of the time. Meaning 70% of the time at the very least, maybe as much as 80% of the time, they miss their target. Where do you think those shells go? Now, with that information, we really do want to give a teacher 4 hours of instruction on the range out in St. Louis County, let them carry some heat into the classroom, and by God, they're going to defend themselves, right? No, they're going to get their kids killed is what's going to happen. Okay?
And then more guns in the metro, we call so.
Absolutely. So you're going to take your guns and bring them into church? I actually know a Baptist minister who carries heat himself in his own church, and it's not in North St. Louis City or County. It's in South County, and he just wants to make sure if somebody comes in, he can gun them down from the pulpit. I'm looking at him and saying, you know, it's going to take you 3 minutes to get out underneath all that vestment or stuff that you're wearing. You know, get a grip. Get a grip. Okay? Point is, this is ludicrous, the notion of using a gun for self-defense. We often are trapped, and this is important information for people who are having that discussion, into the debate about the Second Amendment, most recently adjudicated in a case called Heller versus the District of Columbia. And Heller essentially was the argument that the District of Columbia had the right to prevent private gun ownership within its geographic boundaries. Unfortunately, the court said no, the Second Amendment allows for individual private ownership of guns. Okay? What most of us forget, and certainly the advocates for broader dissemination of firearms forget, is that even Justice Scalia, in fact in his own words, acknowledged that there are reasonable constraints that the state can impose on gun ownership. Now, it hasn't been adjudicated yet, but I think under Scalia's interpretation, we might logically assume that if you are on the terrorism watch list, you probably should not be allowed to walk into Outdoors Limited and buy a long gun, okay?
If you committed a previous murder, you probably shouldn't be able to go to Cabela's and buy a pistol. Okay? I mean, there are places to have reasonable regulation. That discussion needs to be engaged honestly. I think for those of us who are on the side of more sensible regulation and safer gun ownership, we too easily dismiss Second Amendment proponents as the kooks amongst us, the right-wingers, rural, the uneducated, Trump supporters. Okay? No. They're people who have a different interpretation and a different understanding of what the framers of the Constitution intended. And we need to be mindful of that. Current debate is really between unrestrained ownership and sensible regulation. Do not allow yourselves to be trapped in the conversation that this is about banning guns. It's not. It's not. Complex problems truly require complex solutions. Acknowledging the multifaceted nature of gun violence, using evidence to shore up our arguments, and recognizing that no matter what we do, you could ban every gun sale tomorrow, and for generations there will be 300 million functioning guns in this country. We have a long-term systemic problem. And hence, I would argue that the resolution to those have far more to do with the inherent structure of our society, the way we create or limit opportunities, the economic disparity that exists, the educational disparity, the sense of vulnerability, the elitism. So a couple of discussions, questions for discussion. I think each of you have them on your sheet. First of all, how important are guns in your life? What perspective on gun ownership and governmental oversight do you have? To what extent do you believe that gun violence is a problem in the St. Louis area? What strategies might you want to pursue for the remediation of homicides, suicides, and unintentional deaths? And is there a distinct role for the church, the synagogue, the mosque to play? So we have 5 questions, and as we have done previously, we're going to split up for about 10 minutes into 5 groups. So I'm going to number you off, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1 and 2. Okay? 1's up there. 2's here. 3's there. 4 and 5. Okay? Take the one question that you have, wrestle with it a bit, and then we'll reconvene at 25 after and try and put a cap on the conversation.
I'm 3, so you're 4. She asked her the same thing.
I'm glad you didn't jump around. In trouble.
So I have to answer.
Go talk. Go talk.
Okay. To our colleagues in Group 1. General question, how important are guns in your life, the life of your family, or that of your community? And how are guns used, if at all, in your family life or in your community?
Hello.
Hello.
Well, she handed me the paper. But, well, Sheila here talked about, just when you have a gun, being responsible. Of course, not everybody that has a gun is responsible, especially when there's 300 million of those things out there. Hold on. Well, safety around children, of course. I live in a neighborhood that is safe. Like I said to these gals, I can walk and I don't worry about drive-by shootings. Of course, with my luck, I'll go home tonight. But I live in Belleville, and you guys all kind of live in the St. Louis area. So, but we also brought up about that we're all women. And we have determined that testosterone is the problem. Because most of the time, it's men that are involved in these shootings. We didn't bring this up, but teaching our boys, and I have 2 sons, I don't think either one of them is gun owner, and they're not hunters, I don't know, they just didn't get that gene of hunting and wanting to have a gun. So, but I think that's the thing is that, well, oh, look at that. The family unit is falling apart, and we're not raising our boys specifically. I have 2 male friends that shot themselves. I have a friend who, her son shot himself. I have several friends whose sons have shot themselves. Again, the suicide thing. So as far as to what extent, I don't know how you quantify that.
I think it's sort of what I had in mind. And for most of our lives, my late wife and I lived in downtown St. Louis. We were part of that first generation of old house rehabbers. And we got a wild hair at one point and decided we needed a rural experience. So for 5 years, we lived on 7 acres of farmland in southern Illinois, a little town called Bartelso. 265 people in 5 taverns, okay? And one of the classic things about when I asked the question, how do guns function in your life or the life of your community? Every person in that town owned multiple guns, and I'm not talking about a gun or 2, a cabinet full of guns. I don't think anyone owned an AK-47 or a Glock 9mm. They were avid hunters, they were avid target shooters, they hunted every kind of animal known to humankind and had a gun specific for doing that. And hunting was a big part of the life of that community. But it didn't define how you settled your disagreements. Good, thanks. Group 2, what is your perspective on gun ownership and governmental oversight? What do you think?
Well, as far as gun ownership, most of us felt that with the right of a gun, that the Second Amendment right might be there for a lot of reasons, more historical, out of people's fear of losing their freedoms and their rights and their cultures, like what happened in Ireland. So we want to hang on to our guns thinking it might keep us safe. But with that right is the responsibility that whatever happens with your gun, it's your responsibility. You should be punished as well. Just the same way in the example we thought of was if we parked our car on the hill, didn't put it in gear and it ran over 50 people, we're responsible. If we're going to have the right to have something so big and so deadly, then we're responsible. So that's one. What was the other thing? Are there specific experiences shaped our beliefs? We get through a lot of these.
I think that was more, I was more likely to have specific events that were suicides than any homicides in my life, or an accidental, well, not an unintended shooting.
Good point.
Yeah, that shaped my, that with children in my house, I didn't want guns because I did know the statistics.
You know, it seems to me that there's a way to have the conversation about the historic intention of the framers and the Second Amendment, and even allowing, let's allow the broadest interpretation that they really did intend for an individual to have a firearm to protect himself and his family from an overreaching government. Okay? Let's stipulate that. Okay? Do we actually think that even our AK-47s are going to be a match for the state police, let alone our Army, our Marines, our Air Force, our Navy? It's ludicrous. Okay? So part of it seems to me, part of that truth-telling, part of the evidence-based is let's not get caught up in an argument of history. The court has decided that. Let's talk about what it means and what the practicalities are. Okay? Third point, to what extent that you believe gun violence is a problem in your own community?
Well, back here at table 3,
Yep.
we decided it somewhat depends on how you define your community. Since none of us live in particular communities where there's gun violence. It's interesting, I live 2 blocks south of Del Mar in the city. My neighborhood doesn't have guns going off, but I can hear the guns, especially like 4th of July and New Year's. It's a war zone out there. So if I define my community a bit broader than where I walk around, it's a big issue. And so we're affected by that.
What are the factors that you think contribute to that in the broader sense? This is sort of a better together conversation here.
I know in the broader sense, people who don't have any familiarity with where I live think I'm crazy to live there and I must be dodging bullets every day.
Amazing, isn't it? The comment that we made earlier in the evening, the number of people that you've talked to, and certainly I have, who now refuse to go down to a Cardinal baseball game because they are afraid they're going to be mugged, carjacked, or murdered. Okay? Okay. Table number 4. What strategies would you propose to deal with homicides, suicides, or unintended deaths? Anything that comes to mind?
We started out about with the unintended deaths and really like the idea of the gun locks, gun safety type issues in the home, especially so many children, it seems, are shooting themselves or their siblings. And we talked a bit about, I guess a lot of what we were thinking about was related to what the causes might be, like with suicides, and they were kind of long-term solutions, maybe more than the immediate, like, especially for people who are depressed, the psychological help that they need. For homicides, let's see, especially so many caused by either gang violence or drug-related activities or drug deals gone bad or just shooting up neighborhood. Talking about ways that some states are using ways to take people to court who have guns but who present danger to temporarily take the guns away. Ways to help with like a reconciliation process for people in gangs, that kind of thing's been tried. I think I'm probably missing something.
We talked a bit about, I think with homicides, whether or not it would help when people are feeling disenfranchised to have more supportive services for education and other things in the community, or going out in the community and getting to know your neighbor and things that would be setting up a community where people wouldn't feel as hopeless, jobs, education, things like that.
Here's a bit, just as we transition to our last question, a misnomer about gun violence in our communities. Most of us think of the drive-by shooting as drug-related, and it is, but the drug is alcohol. These are 15 to 24-year-olds whose prefrontal cortex is no more better formed than mine was at that age, who are drunk. Okay, point number one. Drugs may be involved not directly, but as a defense of turf, but the real issue is respect. Interviewing those who have been shot and survived, why were you involved in this? They didn't respect me, they didn't respect my girlfriend, they didn't respect my mom. It's about maintaining a sense of self, and you go, oh, gosh, when I was a 15 to 24-year-old guy, that's what a lot was on my mind about who am I and how do I establish who I am in this community. Okay. So one of the things we can do as people of faith is make certain that we don't demonize those who are caught in that. There are explanations for that, and to the earlier conversation, I refuse to acknowledge and accept that these are evil people. They aren't. Okay? Last question. For group 5, is there a distinct role for communities of faith? And what might that be? What do we need to do to help move this debate in a more positive way?
The biggest thing we talked about was facilitating discussions, because there's a lot of different issues and things that people need to talk about. One would be proper information, like what the statistics. I was surprised, as were others, about some of the statistics that you gave tonight, and how you think that, as a teacher, I think, oh, it's all these school shootings, and I'm going to die in a school shooting. But not very likely, especially private work. It's all girls, so.
But they're tough. They're a tough lot. Those Nearings Hall girls are a tough lot.
Right, but also the polarization, even within our faith communities, there's people on both sides of the debate. Those that don't want their guns taken away, and those that don't want guns at all. So facilitating a discussion with just members of your own faith community, so that you can bring both of those sides to the table with the facts. And but then also giving support for people who have crime in their neighborhood, who have maybe not been touched personally by the violence, but who are afraid because of the violence that they hear about, to be a support, emotional support for those situations.
Very good. Anything else? Well, as I wrap it up then, let me say thank you to all of you for the time you've committed to this series of conversations over the course of the month, for your superb questions, which have given me and now Barry much to think about as we revise the materials. This material will be hopefully published electronically by the University of the South this summer. I'll know a little bit more when I meet with them next week about how we're going to do it and what the time frame is. My objective is to make it available free of charge across the church writ large. The point being, we need to use it, we need to have those conversations, and there ought not to be any impediments. I'll leave you with my one favorite thought. You know, the NRA's favorite slogan is, the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. At the Women's March against gun violence a year ago in March downtown, my poster read, the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a priest with a collar. Thank you all. Have a blessed Lent. Don't forget next Tuesday is Shrove Tuesday, and the imposition of ashes next Wednesday. God's blessings. Dave, it's all yours.
Thank you both, Father Mark and Dr. Barry. It was wonderful. I think there's tons of stuff to unpack with all of this. The yellow sheets that I pass out during our break are evaluations. Do the best you can. Those really are helpful to us. We take them very much to heart in planning our future things. I also, because this was on violence, we're having a program at the end of March, a late Saturday program. This young priest is a professor at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. He's a specialist in the spirituality of Thomas Merton, who probably most of you have heard of. Trappist monk, kind of was the beginnings of getting Western and Eastern spiritualities together. So he's going to do a whole day on Merton's spirituality around violence and racism, which I think is really important for our times and for our part of the country. So you want to think about that. And if you like coming here on Tuesday nights, and you don't have any other plans for Lent, on the other side is a totally unrelated series we're starting for Lent. The Passion account for Palm Sunday this year will be read from St. Luke's Gospel. And so Father Sean Martin, who's our president and is a New Testament scholar, will be doing a 4-night series, really going in depth on that Passion account. And so that's coming up. I had room on the backside, so I thought I'd put that on for you. So thank you all for coming. I wish more had come, but bring your friends with you. And if Father Sean was here, he'd say, "Is this your first time here? If it is, don't let it be your last time." Thanks.
Thanks, Dave.